Good evening. Am I audible? Yes, all right. Thank you. Can I also request the host to give me permission to switch on my camera, please? Thank you. Good afternoon. I think we'll wait for about 2-3 minutes before we start because I see there's only one person who's joined. So I'll just give the others about 2-3 minutes and then we'll start the session. All right. So I think most of you have joined. We'll start the session. Hi, I am Meenakshi Ramkumar. I will be co-teaching this course along with Siddharth, who you had met in the previous session. I was initially supposed to take the previous session, but I was unwell, and so Siddharth had to step in for me. So I thank him for that. But I thought let's sort of go over what Siddharth said as a sort of short recap. Let's go through an overview of this course and then see how we're going to progress into session 1 readings today. Before that, I wanted to start with a few housekeeping points, right? This is a course that's, as you may already know, is being sort of instructed for students across all of the diploma programs and the Masters in Business Law program. So it's a It's a lot of you. So the format of this webinar is such that it may not be as interactive as we speak. It's mostly going to be me talking. So it's going to be a lecture style of instruction. And at any point, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A feature, and I will try to address most of your questions. Given this format, to make this course slightly more interactive, what I'm going to be doing is having class exercises. So a lot of you had confusions regarding some of the fictional examples that were shared by Siddharth in the last class. You were like, where could I access it? Right? Those are exercises that we will be doing in class. Before every class, I will handpick a few exercises. I will put them on a Word document and they will be available to you on your LMS platforms, right? So you don't need to worry about that. What you need to read before the class is the reading material that has been uploaded session-wise for each of your readings. That's what you need to do before class, right? Having said that, I also wanted to highlight a few other points. First, this is a safe space. We need to be mindful that all of us come from different learning experiences. So we need to keep that in mind as we sort of go through this. Some of us may have done law previously or engaged with law in some form and may understand certain concepts already and may have an upper hand, but let's not let that sort of hamper the learning of others in this room, right? So that's one thing that I wanted to highlight. Second is that the format of interaction, that the way I instruct is usually I use a PPT. So I will have a PPT that I prepare for each class, and usually I upload my PowerPoint presentation before the class. So even if some of you have issues seeing the screen or the screen gets frozen at any point, you always have the PPT with you as I'm going through the class. So the PPTs will be available beforehand, right? That's the second thing I wanted to address. Third, I'm sure all of you have seen your LMS platforms. That's where we're going to be engaging predominantly outside of the classes, right? We meet twice a month on Saturdays for 2 hours. Beyond that, most of our engagement and interaction is going to be on this LMS platform, right? That's one thing that I also wanted to highlight. So what I will probably do at some point in the class is also take you through the platform. So you can have a look at how the platform is organized, where you will find your readings, where you'll find your additional class exercises, where can you access the PowerPoint presentations. So I will just take you through each of these aspects. Apart from the reading material, there's an announcements tab. So what I would want to convey to you, or what Siddharth wants to convey to you, again, in the interim period that we're not meeting, all of that is going to be happening on the LMS platform on this announcements tab. Sometimes I may pose a question, a prompt, a discussion prompt. You may want to respond to those discussion prompts on that. So that's another aspect that we would be using that announcements tab for. So keep your eye out on the announcements tab every week. The next thing that I also wanted to flag off is that the readings itself. So you would see that for each session, you have dedicated readings. Apart from that, I will, like I mentioned, upload class exercises if they are required for that particular class before the class. So don't stress about it. You're not required to read that and come before the class unless I instruct you to do so. It's there available for you. We will be going through some of these exercises in the class together. Second thing is, apart from readings, recordings, right? You may have noticed that the class recordings are available on LMS for all of you to view. So if you have missed a particular class, you always have the recordings with you. I recommend that you watch the recordings in addition to your readings, because the readings are a starting point. They're a basic starting point. We'll be building on that material in our class discussion, so do not skip class recordings. If you've missed a class, I urge you to please go and watch the recordings. They're available for you. In addition to that, to help out, because of the format in which we are, there's no real chance for interaction. One place that we usually interact is once a month in something called office hours, where we have 1 hour where you can ask us questions based on what has been discussed in the class. For instance, we've had session 1 already, which is a very introductory session. In today's class, we'll be going through more detail on the idea of rules. We'll go into more detail in that, and we may have another class as well. And then we would have an office hour, 1 hour dedicated, where we'll meet. You can ask me questions, doubts, queries that you've had based on what we have discussed so far, right? So this is how our class is going to be structured. Apart from office hours, if you do have any queries, you can always drop me an email or use the LMS platform to reach out to me. I'm going to put in my email ID in the question and answer feature, that box. You're going to see my email ID there. So you can always reach out to me on my email ID if you have any specific query regarding the syllabus that you may want to get clarified urgently. All right. Now, this takes care of most of the housekeeping points. As you may already have seen the structure of the course in the last class, I'm also going to take you through the structure once again in this class as well. In addition to that, I also wanted to highlight your exams, because this is a concern that many of you may have, right, is usually in the format of 2 formative assessments and 1 summative assessment. The formative assessment, you'll get dates for it. Usually when we complete a module or 2, we will have the first formative assessment, which will be in an MCQ format. The second formative assessment will be again after we complete a module or so. Again, MCQ format. And then finally, when we've completed the entire syllabus, the entire course, you will have a final summative assessment, which is a pen and paper descriptive test, right? So this is just to give you a heads up on this is how the examination format is going to be. Details, questions that you may have, do hold on to those questions. You'll get clarification soon. Don't need to get too tensed and stressed about it. I understand evaluations can be quite intimidating, but don't worry too much about it. You will be given proper guidance and you are not going to be left in the dark to fend for yourselves, right? So as and when we have dates finalized, we get formats finalized, you will be intimated about it. So don't stress about that at all. I'm just giving you this as a heads up for you to understand the structure itself. Before I go on to the next point, I see a few hands up. Maybe you joined in slightly late. If you have a question, please drop it in the Q&A. Don't put your hands up. I may not be able to see it and I'll miss that point. So instead of doing that, drop it in the question and answer. I usually pause a number of times during the session itself. So I will pick up your questions then. So avoid putting your hands up. If you have a question, query, doubt, please put it in the Q&A box. All right. I'm going to stop at this juncture before I move to the actual lecture to just see what the question and answers are currently. Some of you have said that I'm not audible. I don't know if that's a problem, which is one person, because others seem to be following. So you may want to just check your audio there. Second, with regard to bridge course, yes, this is a bridge course for MBL program. So I think you're not graded, you're not marked on it, but you can reach out to the PACE administrative team for any further clarifications on that. Yes, this class applies for all PG diploma courses, right? All PG diploma courses, be it in child rights, be it in human rights, be it in medical law, any of this, you will be going through this course, and I will explain why this course can apply across all PGD programs in just a bit. All right. The volume from my side, I think it seems to be fine for most of you. I don't know. I think few of you are struggling. You may want to consider using earphones if that's more helpful for you. Yeah, and you should be able to access the class recordings at any time. They're available to you on LMS. You cannot download them, but you'll have to log into your LMS. I will show you exactly where you can find these, and you'll understand how you can access that as well. Right? Exams are not going to be open book. They will be closed book. I told you formats of the assessments. You will be given enough guidance, enough clarifications. I just give you a heads up right now, right? You will be getting that more soon. I mean, I can't change the way I speak. Some of you are asking me to speak in a different dialect. I don't know if I can do that, but I will try to speak more slow so that you can follow what I'm saying, right? With respect to books and reading material, most of the reading material are available on LMS that you require for the course. So I don't see an issue there. Second, is with respect to additional reading material, I will recommend some that may not be mandatory for you to do for the purposes of this course, but I will give you only because some of you may be interested in that particular subject. All right. Like I mentioned, the video chat option will not, the video and audio, I'm sorry, as the as students, you may not be able to switch on your videos and audios. That feature is not available with us. So you can put in your questions and remarks and queries in the chat box and I will attend to it, right? So that is something that you may want to just keep in mind. Even if you put your hand up, I will not be able to call out to you. You'll have to put in your comments in the chat, in the Q&A box. I just thought I'll take this time to show you the LMS platform. I hope all of you can see my screen, right? This will be your LMS platform when you open it. You go to the general tab. Here you'll see announcements. Professor Siddharth has just shared his notes from the previous session, the introductory notes. So you can access that here. If I click on an announcement, you see you have further queries to that. That's also been answered. So we can build a thread on a particular discussion like this. I may put up a discussion prompt on the announcement tab and you may want to respond to that. I told you, in addition to the readings, during class, we will be going through various exercises. Those exercises are available as well. I've uploaded it for today's session over here. You should be able to access that. Class recordings, you see the tab on the right, I'm sorry, on the left, you'll see class recordings. You click that, you have the entire recording available to you. You can watch it at any time. In addition to that, I've also uploaded the PPT for today's class. So like I mentioned in the beginning, I usually upload the PPT before the class. So it's always accessible to you before the class itself. So this is what I just wanted to show you. This is what your LMS looks like, and this is where we will be interacting outside of these 2 hours on Zoom. Okay, let's go into today's class then. I'm just going to share my PPT. I hope that's visible as well. So what I noticed is Siddharth in the last class had actually taken you through an overview of the course. He took you through the various modules in the course, right? So what I'm going to do is sort of recap that first and then move into today's class, which is focusing on the first module, which is rules itself. Why this course? You've had enough discussions in the last class. I think some very interesting points that Siddharth brought out about our inherent ideas of law. How do we challenge these inherent ideas? How law is not as black and white as we think it to be. How it interacts with other philosophical questions. How it interacts with political questions. It's not an isolated field, right? So we need to keep that in mind as we progress through this course. What is the purpose of this course itself? Think of it as a starting point. And like one of you mentioned in the chat box, in the Q&A box, sorry, that most of you don't come from a law background, right? So having not come from that law background, a lot of the courses that you may do, you will find it very intimidating. The purpose of this course is to help you understand that law has a certain internal logic to it. We'll try to uncover what that logic is in this course. So it will help you sort of navigate in all of your various diploma courses as well, right? Because yes, some of you may be doing human rights, some of you may be doing child rights, some of you may be doing commercial law, but there is a certain internal logic to the law that is consistent across these. Of course, technicalities are there. There are certain variations in each of these branches, each of these streams, but this certain one thing that unifies them as the law, as a legal system, we'll try to uncover that so that you find navigating those courses slightly easier. That's the purpose of this course itself. It's a foundational course. You build on this course through your other courses. It's not a standalone course. Don't think of this as one course that doesn't interact with other courses. Constantly think about connections between this course and your other courses. Draw those connections. It's important that you do that and you don't think of this as one standalone, isolated course. It gives you, as the name suggests, an introduction to the Indian legal system, the various sources of law in the Indian legal system, what are the institutions in the Indian legal system, how do they interact with each other, why do we need to know any of this as students of law, right? Because we're going to be engaging with these institutions. Whichever capacity, we will be engaging with these various institutions, and that's why it's important to understand how these institutions are structured, what is their role, what is the source of law emerging from these various institutions, what is the hierarchy amongst them, and these are things that we will uncover through this course itself. And what we intend to do towards the end is look at three sort of illustrative branches of law, which is contract law, criminal law, and tort law. Some of you may be doing standalone courses on this in your various diplomas, but the reason that we spend just some time on these as distinct courses, as distinct branches of law, and some of the principles that help inform how these branches of law operate, we will look at in this course as illustrative of us applying the various principles we have studied to these branches so that you get an idea of how you applied what you have studied in this course with your other specific subjects as well. So that's the overview of this course. The modules, first two modules will be focusing on rules and rule systems. This third module will be particularly focused on the Indian legal system. So think of it as a zooming in exercise through the course. What we're going to do, we're going to start with this broad idea of what is rules, how is law a rule, right? How are various legal rules working with each other to form a legal system? Then we understand legal systems generally and we zoom in further to look at the Indian legal system. So think of it, we're starting at a zoomed out space and we keep zooming in through the course to look at the Indian legal system. We look at each institution. So we zoom in further within the Indian legal system. We look at the legislature, we look at the executive, we look at the judiciary. We understand how to work with these rules. And then we zoom in further in the Indian legal system to look at particular branches of law like torts, criminal law, contract law. So for me to build that structure through the course, just imagine it as a funnel and we're constantly zooming in at each level. So in today's class, for the first few classes that I'll be taking, we're going to be broadly in the zoomed out space. Siddharth is going to step in for a bit of the zooming in when we look at the Indian legal system, and I will supplement that towards the end with the various branches of law. So on this module, what we're going to primarily look at is what are rules, what are the various characteristics of rules, what are rule systems, how do they work, a concept called rule pervasiveness, the relationship between a rule and the purpose of the rule, what we call a rationale of the rule, a concept called rule generality. We look at sources of rules and we look at how different rules work with each other. It's not always one rule, one system that's operating. We'll see different systems working together, and that's what we call rule plurality. So that's the broad breakup of this module itself. Usually what I tend to do, I thought I should mention this. I start my PPTs with an agenda slide usually. That helps us sort of prepare ourselves for what's happening in that session. So you also get an understanding of what we will be covering in that session. So think of this slide as your agenda for this module, not just this session, right? Why is it important to study rules? Why are we hopping on? Why am I here on a Saturday afternoon, right after lunch, talking about these rules? Why is it important, right, for this course? What we're trying to do with this is to understand what rules are, of course, but also how lawyers are using them, right? That's what we're interested in. That's going to be our takeaway. But for that takeaway, we first need to understand what a rule is. For us to be able to take anything concrete away from this course in terms of how lawyers work with them, we need to understand what rules are in the first place, right? And then we'll notice that there are rules around us at all times, every day, from the time we wake up till until the time we sleep. The number of rules we encounter in our everyday life makes rules all the more important to understand, right? It's there all around us, and that's what we call it rule pervasiveness. We're also trying to understand the difference or the interaction between rules and their reasons. This is again very important for a lawyer to understand the rationale or the purpose or the reason for a particular rule, because that's what will help them interpret a rule much better to apply to a particular fact situation in hand, right? So that interaction between the rule and rationale, once again, is very, very important for a lawyer. We'll think about how legal rules apply to members of a society, and not just one or two specific people, because they have general application. There is a sense of generality that's associated with legal rules, right? So we'll look at that concept in a little more detail, and we'll also see what legal rules are. Where do they come from? How do you identify a legal rule? What makes it a legal rule and not, say, a cultural rule or a political rule or a social rule? How is a legal rule different? So when we zoom in from the broad rules to the legal rule, we'll also try to understand what makes something a legal rule itself. Then we'll also see how one set of rules it's not just one set of rules that apply at all times, it's multiple sets that are working together. How do you navigate such a system when you're working with multiple rules? What do I look for? Where do I find them? These are various things that we're going to be discussing through this module that will carry on, that will seep in to our discussions through the course across other modules as well, right? So why don't you all open that document, the Word document that I called session 1 exercises, and read. Just take about 5 minutes to read that first exercise, and then we will have a discussion. In the meantime, I'm also going to check for questions. Okay. One question that I thought I'll quickly pick up is whether this course covers legislative drafting. No, we'll not look at legislative drafting. What we'll look at in the legislation module is how is the legislature as an institution functioning? Briefly, very briefly, we won't get into the details of that. What we're more interested in is the source of law that emerges from the legislature, which is your statute, which is your act, your law, right? So we're more interested in that. So we will not be looking at drafting, but we will try to understand the parts of a law, the parts of a bill. Why are those parts important for us to better apply a law as a lawyer? Right. You are supposed to open the Word document, exercise 1. I'll also put it up on the screen for those of you who are struggling with that. If you could just hang on a minute. You have to look, this is the exercise that I'm talking about. You have to read the first exercise, which is an excerpt from a play written by Girish Karnad. So if you could just read that excerpt, then we will start our discussion on rules itself. Okay, I'll just show you where you can access it on LMS as well. Some of you are struggling with that. So you go to your LMS, you log in. This is the page that's visible. All that you have to go under the general section. You see session 1 exercises. You just need to click on that. Take about 2 more minutes. Then we start discussing. All right. Should we start discussions? Okay. So the first, you may have noticed that what the king is doing in this extract is coming up with a new set of rules. So the first thing let's try to do, if you look at the reflection questions, try and identify the rule or rules that the Sultan has introduced in the extract above. So if you could just put in the chat box what you may think is a rule. Which of these are rules? What did you identify as rules? Okay, a duty to pay tax. Some of you have used the word duty. Keep that in mind. We'll see how a duty maybe is duty a kind of rule, right? What kinds of rules are there? Justice for all. Okay, 5 times namaz. The rule of shifting the capital. Reading the Quran, right? Most of you have said 5 times. Some of you have said justice and equality. Yes, sorry, one thing, just to clarify, the chat box is disabled. Use the Q&A feature to interact with me. Yeah. Um, yes, so most of you have identified various things that you've called rules, right? Mostly praying 5 times a day, shifting of the capital, the tax, the exemption, right? So you see a rule, which is a tax, and under that you see an exemption where a person need not abide by that rule. So keep these ideas in your head. You may have seen these ideas in the reading as well, and we'll look at what each of these things mean in a little bit, right? So most of you have identified these rules. On what basis did you call them rules? Why are some things in the passages rules and why are some things not rules, right? What makes a rule then? Can anyone tell me what is a rule? Why did you identify these things as rules from the extract? Something which they're bound to follow. There's some amount of enforcement in it. It has come from a certain authority, the king, right? It, many of you have identified authority. So the person, where the source is what gives the rule, its mandate as a rule. Okay. Some of you have said it's because of the consequences of not following it. It's binding. Sanctions, right? It's mandatory for you to follow. So all of these make something a rule. But if you had looked at the reading, they try to describe what exactly a rule is. And we're going to look at what that rule is and what are the characteristics of the rule. A lot of what you have actually said has been covered in this definition. If you looked at the piece that was shared for your readings today, they describe a rule as a general norm mandating or guiding conduct or action in a given type of situation. So they try to formulate this statement with a formula, right? So they're saying it's a norm that's mandated. Most of you have identified it. It's trying to tell you to do something. It's guiding your actions. in a particular situation. Let's try to understand. If I have to break down this definition of a rule into a formula, what does it mean? A typical rule is something that prescribes in a particular circumstance that we will call X. So if X circumstance is there, Y behavior needs to be followed, right, by Z category of people. So you see, there is an X. So when X, that is the particular circumstance, is there, you're supposed to act in a manner Y. Who are the people who are supposed to act in this manner? The category of people, that is Z. Let's try putting a general rule about, say, traffic signals within this formula to see how it fits as a rule. So the first is, let's identify the circumstance X. The circumstance X here is when the light turns red in a traffic signal. The thing that you need to do, the Y that you need to do, is that you need to stop your car at the stop line, or you can look at it as you can't continue driving. Who does this apply for? Anyone who's driving a vehicle on that road. That is the category set. Yeah. So most of the rules that you identified, be it the tax, the religious tax, be it the rule on the numbers, be it the rule on shifting of the capital, will mostly fall within this broad understanding of a rule with these categories of the circumstance X, the behavior Y, and the people set. If that is what it is, what can we identify as characteristics of a rule? First characteristic of a rule is that it is normative. Does anyone know what the term normative means? Have you come across this at some point? They're prescriptive, absolutely. So they're prescribing you to do something. And there's an underlying element of that is the right way to do things, right? That is the normative element of a rule. And the reason we distinguish a rule from something like, say, what the authors in the piece have called a prudential norm is that there's no sense of rightness or wrongness associated with a prudential norm. What is a prudential norm? Right? What is that prudential norm that the authors are talking about in the piece shared for today? Is, say, you may say that a particular way of behavior will lead to a particular result. A rule of thumb, right? You strike a ball in a certain way in a cricketing game, you will get a certain result, right? That is a prudential norm. There's no sense of right or wrong to it. You don't have to follow it. It is telling you to do something. It is guiding your action. It's telling you this is how I face a particular ball while striking it in a cricketing game. But it is not saying that that's the right way or wrong way of doing things. That underlying notion of right and wrong is not there with these prudential norms that the author says. Another example they give you, evading tax, right? You can have prudential norms telling me if I do XYZ things, if I structure my finance in a certain way, I structure my transaction in a certain way, I can avoid paying tax. It's a particular action that gives a particular result, but it doesn't have an inherent notion of right and wrong. They don't care if that's morally right to do. There's no concern for whether it is the morally wrong thing to do, right? Unlike a rule which has that inherent understanding of rightness and wrongness, which is what gives a rule that characteristic of normativeness. Second is its general. What do we mean by general? It applies to anybody who falls within category Z. If we go back to this formula, by persons of class Z, it applies to everybody in class Z. It is not a rule that I have said today If I come today in class and say, today my voice is not good, and so I'm going to only use the chat feature only today, it applies only in this circumstance. It's not it doesn't have the same general categorization that a rule has. It doesn't apply generally in all circumstances of X to all people Z. It is something very specific, right? So a rule generally has a generality to it where it applies to a large section of people. Of course, this people is not everybody. It can be limited. Like for instance, in the traffic signal rule, it applies to people who drive a vehicle, right? It may not apply to someone else who's not on that route. So of course it is limited, but it applies to everybody who's driving a vehicle on that road, and that sense of generality is another characteristic of the rule. Third thing, it serves as a guide or standard for behavior. And fourth, it gives a justification for a human action. Tomorrow, if someone asks you why you're stopping at a red light, that justification is there because there is a rule, the traffic rule that requires me to stop at that red light. And that justification combined with that generality characteristic of a rule means there's some level of uniformity, right? It reduces arbitrariness because there is that justification for human action combined with that generality of a rule that leaves less space for arbitrariness. Keep this in mind, this idea of arbitrariness and this idea of justification, because we're going to come back to this concept in the second module when we look at the concept of rule of law. What do we mean by the rule of law? We'll come back to in the second module, but just keep these characteristics of a rule in mind because we're going to keep coming back to these concepts through the course itself. Fine, these are the various characteristics of the rules. What makes a rule, right? What are the various constituents of the rule? What are the elements of a rule? The first thing that you would notice is every rule has a content. What is that rule stating, right? There is a content to that rule. The second element that's very important for a rule is its form. How is that rule presented to you? In what form is it presented to you, right? The third element is rationale. That is the purpose of the rule, the reason for the rule. Why is that rule there? Why is that rule being implemented? That's what we mean by rationale, which is a third element of the rule. And finally, the fourth one is effect, right? What is the final impact of this rule? You have the content is delivered to you in a particular form. There's a reason why this rule exists, but what is coming out of this rule? What is the effect of that rule, right? These are the various elements of a rule, and we're going to think about each of these elements in more detail throughout the course, right? So just I wanted to flag these off right at the beginning at a conceptual level for you to understand, because these are terms that are going to be thrown at you. So before some of you may or may not understand where these terms are coming from. So I thought I'll clarify that at this stage and then progress to the course material. This is also there, or some of these words are also there in the piece that you may have read today for today's class as well. These are not terms that are new, entirely new to you. You may have looked it up when you read the piece if you were unfamiliar with it before, but I thought I will also flag it off over here. So what we've looked at so far, what is a rule? What are the characteristics of a rule? What makes a rule, right? And what are the various elements of a rule? The parts, you can loosely call it the parts of a rule, right? So this is where we are at so far. Rules can be of various kinds, right? Of different kinds. And that's what we have seen time and again in the piece as well. And you will see through the course itself. Some rules can impose a duty. So one of you had mentioned from the Tughlaq piece, a duty to act a certain way, right? So what those rules expect of you is to behave in a certain manner. Some rules can be prohibitory in nature. So they will tell you not to behave in a certain manner. They will say certain behaviors are not permitted. So you have rules that tell you to behave in a certain manner, rules that tell you you can't behave in a certain manner, some rules that just give you powers. They give you a power to be able to do something. It's up to you whether you actually do it or not. To that extent, it may not be as mandatory as you may think it is, right? It says I may or may not do something, right? It gives me some sort of discretionary power. Let's give an example, right? I walk into a classroom. I also teach offline courses, right? So when I do offline courses, I take attendance, and I have the power to decide whether I should give someone attendance if they come in 10 minutes late or not. I can choose whether I give that person attendance when they've come in 10 minutes late to the classroom, right? That's a power, that's a discretionary power that is given to me, a choice that is given to me to exercise whether I can give a person who's walked into class late attendance or not. That's a discretionary power that I have. There's no rule mandating me to say I have to give them attendance. There's no rule prohibiting me from saying that I can't give them attendance. The rule is giving me some sort of discretionary power whether I give that person attendance or not. There could be other kinds of rules that provide for distribution of benefits. Some of you spoke about justice, spoke about religious duties, right? These can all come within the ambit of providing distribution of benefits, right? And of course, there are some which, and these are sort of, they can be conditions, and if you follow those conditions, then certain consequences will follow. For instance, a rule sort of that you can say is if you attend classes, you pay attention to classes, right? That being the condition, you may perform well, right? Because that is a condition. If you fulfill that condition, a particular consequence would follow, right? These are various kinds of rules that are there. We have already discussed the difference between a prudential norm and a normative rule. We have already looked at this category. Let's look at another category, descriptive and prescriptive rules. What do we mean by a descriptive versus prescriptive rule? Let's take an example, right? A descriptive rule is just telling us what something is, that the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. That is a descriptive rule. A prescriptive rule, on the other hand, is telling you how something ought to be. That's how it should be, right? I told you about that normative element that's there in these rules. That comes from prescriptive rules and not descriptive rules. So descriptive rules tell you how something is, and prescriptive rules tell you how something should be. That's the difference between a descriptive rule and a prescriptive rule. What do you mean by a constitutive rule? What do we mean by this idea of constitutive rules? These are rules that are creating something. As the name suggests, they are constituting something. The Constitution of India, an entire module that you have set up, entire session that you have dedicated to the Constitution, contain these constitutive rules, which is setting up something, right? So these are the various kinds of rules that we come across. These are not exhaustive. There are more rules. These are just illustrative. They're just giving us examples of the various kinds of rules that we encounter on an everyday basis. I'm just going to stop my screen sharing for a minute to just check if there are any questions. Okay, I think most of you have just been responding to some of the questions that have been asked. Okay, one of you have asked this question: who determines what is normative and what's not qualified to do so? Norms could always change. Change is the only constant. Of course, normative values are subjective first. They are not objective. What is right and wrong for someone may not be right and wrong for another person, right? So norms are subjective. But what differentiates a norm from a prudential rule is, or sorry, a normative rule from a prudential rule is that there is an inherent understanding of right and wrong. What that right is, what that wrong is may change. It can evolve over time. It can be different. It can be conflicting, but there is that idea of right and wrong imbibed in it, right? That is the distinction. I hope that helps clarify your question. Another question, who decides what is right and wrong? Like I said, what is right and wrong is very, very subjective, right? For today, the lawmaker, people in power, in the position, many of you mentioned in Tughlaq, right? How did you identify what is the law? Because it came from the king. The king is the one who is making that decision in that case on who is what is right and what is wrong. It depends on the authority who's given the power to make these decisions, right? And it's not always that there are rules only when there is power, right? We look at some examples of rules where there is no power as well. Particularly, there's this example of Pippi Longstock, and I'll come to that example in just a bit, right? So hold on to that thought. But generally, many of you mentioned when you were identifying rules from the Tughlaq example, why was something a rule? Because it came from an authority. The authority is deciding what is right and wrong. The authority is deciding what is the rule. Okay. So some of you, one question that I see repeatedly is that again, I'll explain the normative example. What do we mean by normative? What is it about a rule that makes it normative? It's prescribing a particular behavior. We all agree. It's telling us what we should do or what we should not do with an inherent understanding of it being right or wrong, right? It's prescribing with notions of what is the right way to do things, what is the wrong way to do things, right? You think about it as also with with a sort of contrast to descriptive rules. Descriptive rules are just telling us what is, right? This is what is happening. This is how things are happening. Prescriptive element is telling us how it should happen because there's a right way to do things. This is how it should be done. It's not just telling us this is how it is done. It is telling us how it should be done, which is giving it that inherent idea of right and wrong, right? I gave you an example, for instance, of the point on, it's there in your readings as well, that if a certain ball is bowled a certain way in a cricket game, that you strike it at a certain angle to get the best results. This is not telling me how, it is telling me how I should behave, but it's not telling me that's exactly how I should do things. That's how it should be. All that it is telling me is if I do it a certain way, I get a certain result. It's not saying, doesn't have this idea that that is the right way to do things. That is the only way to do things, right? It doesn't have that prescriptive value attached to it. And that's how that prudential norm is different from, say, a law that tells you that a right thing to do is actually not commit murder. That there is an inherent understanding of right and wrong in a law that prohibits murder or that prohibits theft. How are we deciding this right and wrong? Which is right, which is wrong? The person in authority who has the power to decide that. We saw that in the Tughlaq example as well. Another question that some of you have asked is, are rules and law the same? What we will see through in today's class is there are various kinds of rules, right? Legal rules are one such. Go back to the zooming in example that I said at the beginning. Rules are the broader sort of category. We'll zoom into one particular kind of rules that are legal rules or law, right? So think of it as that zooming in exercise that we're going to do. But broadly understanding what rules are, what are the structure of these rules, and what are legal rules, how is a legal rule distinct from, say, a cultural rule. That is the discussion that we're going to have in this class in the next hour. and in the next class as well. Right? One of you have asked a very good question also about the relationship between a rule and its rationale. Hold on to your thoughts on that. We'll spend enough time on this idea of rule and rationale and how values of justice may come to help us understand that relationship better. We'll do that with an example in the next hour as well, right? Because many of you, again, when you were identifying rules in the Tughlaq piece, had mentioned the justice point. You mentioned justice, you mentioned equality. What do these values mean? How do they interact with rules? What relationship does it have with its rationale? We'll look at in the second hour. One thing that I forgot to mention in the first 5 minutes of the housekeeping bit is, because this format is such that it's usually going to be me giving a lecture and I don't want that to go on for 2 hours. It may be too much for all of us to soak in. We usually take a 10-minute break at 4. So we'll take that 10-minute break now and we'll resume again at 4:10. You may use this time to just drink some water, think about your thoughts, reflect on what we have discussed so far, and we'll come back at 4:10. All right, should we start? Okay, I'm going to start by answering one of the questions in the chat box that I had addressed before the break. That is about the difference between normative and prescriptive. Normative and prescriptive are used interchangeably. They mean the same thing to a large extent when they're trying to tell you how something should be as opposed to how something is. That is the main difference between normative and descriptive. And normative and prescriptive are used interchangeably. They both more or less mean the same thing in this context that we have been discussing so far. All right. With that, let's continue to, so the first question where we identified the rules in the Tughlaq extract help us understand what a rule is. Right? Now let's look at the other questions in that exercise. I'm sharing the screen so that those of you who don't have the exercise copy handy can have a look at this. I'm highlighting the first one. How do you think the Sultan introduced these rules to the people of the country? Did he try to provide an explanation for them? Did he seek the people's approval for his decision? Think about this, just reflect on this for a minute. And then maybe what I will try to do is I'll probably permit one of you to talk and you can share your reflections. So those of you who have your hands raised, I'll probably permit you to talk and you can share your reflections. Mihir, would you like to say, share with us?
Oh, sorry, I raised for something else. No.
Okay. If it's a query or doubt, please put it in the chat box. You can lower your hand otherwise. I'm so sorry. Am I audible now? So I was on mute. I'm so sorry about that earlier. Um, I was saying that some of you have mentioned in the question and answer what your reflections on that question have been. You have said that, sorry, 1 second, I'm just trying to open it. Yeah. Some of you have said that the orders of the Sultan seem to be fiats to be followed. The decision on capital had an element of voluntary adherence to it. It was a unilateral decision that was imposed on people, no intention to seek approval. There was no form of public consultation. The Sultan sought support and cooperation. It was unilateral, right? Um, you also say he just declared the law to the citizens without taking any feedback from the stakeholders. He has provided a reason, but he hasn't taken any approval because he's an authority, right? So various reflections on this, right? To just go back to that question once more, right? I'm sorry, I'm going to share my screen. So the purpose of highlighting the manner in which these decisions are taken is to also understand that that may not be something that is applicable today. Today, there is a sense, and that's the sort of third question. If you could see, do you think that the rules that the Sultan introduced and the way he introduced them are still followed in our country today? How are things different in India today from the time of Sultan Muhammad Tughlaq? We have processes in place. The constitution is giving a certain body, a certain institution, the power to make these rules. They tell you that, and then these institutions have rules within themselves, deciding the constitutive rules that we discuss as one form of rule, telling us how they need to come up with these rules. The level of arbitrariness, you can think whether it is still there despite these rules being in place with respect to how laws are made. You can think about that, right? Whether these rules, just because we have the constitution and we have these rules in place that tell us how rules are to be implemented and enforced, there is this element of arbitrariness that is not there, or if it is there, something for you to think about. But the purpose of having this question in the first place is to tell you we'll be reflecting more on the third aspect, the third question, which is the process that's followed in India today on what is considered to be a valid legal rule, how is it to be made, what is the content of that rule, in which form does it need to be made, right? There is a process and procedure in place for that, and you will be discussing that in more detail in module 3 when you look at the Indian legal system, right? I just wanted to flag that off here, just because um, the Sultan's rules are of a certain kind, the legal rules we see today are of a different kind. Doesn't mean these are not rules. Both are rules. It's just the process through which these rules are made are different in both contexts, and we look at the Indian context in more detail in the independent Indian context in more detail in the third module, right? Um, but why do rules matter, right? We've been discussing a lot about rules. Why do these rules even matter? Can I request you to please read exercise 2? This shouldn't take more than 2-3 minutes, this exercise. If you could just read that, take about 2 minutes to read that, and then we'll discuss why rules matter. Okay, I'll wait for some of you to share your reflections on the Q&A box, and then we'll discuss why rules matter. Okay, some of you have said that rules are created to regulate the public and allow society to function smoothly. You say to maintain social order, avoid chaos, to get things done, right? So there's some sense of orderly behavior that stems from this idea of rules. It helps prevent chaos. Okay, just gonna scroll down for more. It helps organize, to bring discipline. Fair enough. Clarity, consistency. There's some common purpose that these rules serve. Great reflections, right? These are great things for us to think, start thinking about these rules that we see around us every day, what they mean, how they're structured. But it's also important that somewhere we understand. Let's think about this passage, right? You've learned your lesson, you've completed your assignment, but because you violated the rule about being on time, you cannot attend your music lesson. You may be on a motorcycle. You think you can easily navigate around potholes without disturbing the road repair workers, but you will be fined for riding on the wrong side of the road anyways. So, what is this key attribute of these rules? Is that what they really say matters, right? These, what the content of these rules are, they matter. We may think we can navigate around them, but there may be consequences for that, right? And that's why the law is so focused on rules, because at the end of the day, a lot of the work that you will be doing in your various courses through your programs here is to try to understand what the rule says, because what it says is what ultimately matters, right? So first we try to understand what the rules say, then we try to understand how to apply them in different situations. Some may think being punished for not following a rule is unfair, right? Suppose the sign on the other side of the road in the passage said no vehicles allowed. It seems straightforward that you will be fined if I take a motorcycle or a car on that side of the road. But what if you took a bicycle, right? What if you were on roller skates? What if you were pushing a baby on a stroll or a pram, right? What about these? Does this mean that you've broken that rule? Does that mean you need to be penalized for breaking that rule? These are gray areas. They're ambiguous areas. And sometimes that's when we may not just look at what the rule says, right? You may look at why a rule is there in place, the rationale, right? That will help us understand how it applies in a particular situation. So first we try to understand what the rule says. Sometimes that may not give us clarity, it may not give us an answer on whether it applies to category X or not. Then you try to maybe look at why that rule is there to help understand that, why it applies in a particular situation, right? So in this case where we're saying that the rule says no vehicles is allowed, we need to understand why that rule is there. So if the purpose of the rule is to ensure safety, then maybe cycling or skating is also not permitted in that particular example. In that particular case, you may be fined for that, because if the purpose of the rule is to ensure your safety, then you're not safe even if you're on a bicycle or on your roller skates to drive on that side, to ride on that side of the road. So there, the rationale or the purpose of the rule will help us understand to some extent whether that rule applies in a particular situation or not. But if the purpose of the rule is to just ensure that the repair workers can move around more freely and do their work without, cars coming in their way, without vehicles coming in their way, then, maybe cyclists or pram pushers also cannot, maybe pram, then there maybe even pram pushers will be an obstacle, and therefore they may not be permitted on that side of the road. How do we then decide when when a rule applies to a particular situation or not, right? This is where we typically look to lawyers and judges, and they have to help us understand not only what the rule says, of course, what the rule says itself sometimes is very complex for us to sort of break down. So we need to first try to see how a lawyer reads a rule and then how they apply it. Then we also have to see, why it says what it says, what is the rationale for it. And then we can, you know, carry out that exercise of understanding the relationship between the rule and its purpose, and thereby how we apply it, right? So a good lawyer or a judge would try to understand why the rule says what it says and then decide whether you're in violation of that rule or not. Yeah, this is that relationship between rule and rationale, and first giving us an idea of why these rules matter in the first place, because it has consequences that can affect us. I'll stop here to just check if there are any questions. Okay, most of you have just shared your reflections on why rules matter. Okay, there is one question here. Right. So one of you have asked this question, which is pertinent for our discussion in today's class. You have said you wonder if such stringent focus on rules and maintaining order allows legislation to transcend its limits and draft laws that override individual rights. While rules are essential for maintaining order, can we argue that in certain cases, bypassing those rules, like permitting two-wheelers to use the opposite side of the road, might reduce traffic congestion? Right? So I'm just going to say, hold on to your thought at this point, right? I'm going to come back to this very idea about when we're talking about rule and rationale, whether a rule can be over inclusive or under inclusive. They seem like big ideas, right? But I'm going to explain and break that down to you. So I'll tell you simply now, and then we'll come back to it in just a bit. First, what do we mean? So say there is a rule like you don't ride beyond a certain speed limit. Let's take an example of a speed limit, right? So you say the speed limit is 60 kilometers per hour on a particular route. And you say vehicles cannot go beyond that speed limit. There is an ambulance. An ambulance is a vehicle. And sometimes, the ambulance may need to go, faster than 60 kilometers per hour. They go by 80 kilometers per hour. Now, the rule just has a general wording. No vehicle is permitted to go beyond 60 kilometers per hour speed on this particular road. What is the rationale or the reason for this rule? To ensure safety, right? But when I say no vehicle, including ambulances, should not cross that speed limit, there I may actually be compromising the very idea of safety, because the person's whose life is in question, or who needs to be taken to the hospital immediately, right? It may be safer for that person to sort of go beyond 60 to save their life. And the ambulance driver may be experienced and knows how to handle the vehicle at these high speeds. They've been trained to do that. In that case, what this rule that says no vehicles are permitted, including ambulances, it's an over-inclusive rule. It's going beyond its rational justification. It's going beyond its rationale. It's going beyond its purpose, right? Similarly, you could have under-inclusive rules. Let's take a law, for instance. Let's take topical. We've seen recent statements by the statement of sort of position of the central government on this issue. It's a topical issue, right? Marital rape. You have rape laws in place because you want to respect consent and safety of a person's bodily integrity, that a person has control over their body, right? And you have rape laws that prevent any sort of incursion to that bodily autonomy, that bodily liberty that a person has, right? That's the rationale for rape laws, to respect consent, to respect bodily integrity. But the law here does not take into account marital rape, which means it's under inclusive. The rule is how to say, is lesser in scope, lesser in ambit than the rationale itself. It's not serving that rationale completely, right? To that extent, rules can be over inclusive or under inclusive if we look at its relationship with rationale. Yeah, this is some discussion I wanted to have towards the end of today's class, but because this question came, I just thought I will highlight that here. Okay, one of you have asked this question: when rules are published, do they come with a rationale? No, not necessarily. We see various laws that are being passed around us. We know traffic rules exist. We intuitively may understand that this is the rationale for that rule, or you can find the rationale for those rules through other sources. It may not come attached with the rule. One place for you to look at, say you see a law that is being passed, one place you find the rationale for it, legislative debates. And you may see when we do the process of legislative, how a legislation is is sort of made in the parliament, the process, when we go through that process, you will see that there is first something called a bill that is introduced. Usually a bill comes with a statement of purpose, statement of objects and reasons, and that will tell you what the purpose of the rule is. Another place for you to look at, of course, so you can look at that document. You could look at legislative debates, why a certain thing is being introduced. If the rule is coming from a judgment, you look at the judgment may have a reasoning for why a certain thing is the rule, right? So these are the various sources from which you can try to understand the rationale. It doesn't always come to you handy written down with the rule itself. Okay, just one step back. What is the rationale? Rationale is nothing but the purpose of the rule. Why is the rule introduced? What is the rule trying to do? What is that issue that the rule is trying to solve for? That is the rationale of the rule, the purpose of the rule, right? Why it's there in the first place. One of you have said judges don't see a rationale of the rule. That is not true. In a lot of instances, judges do see a rationale of the rule. When do we see the rationale of the rule? Right? When the content of the rule straight directly answers a question, we don't need to see the rationale. Let's take this example of no vehicles permitted in the park. This is the rule. We know a four-wheeler, a car is a vehicle, right? We know a two-wheeler, a motorbike is a vehicle. But what about a person pushing a pram? Is that a vehicle? We do not get a direct answer just by looking at the rule. That's when we may have to look at the rationale of the rule to see whether the pram is also covered within that understanding of vehicle or not. So it's not the case that judges do not see the rationale of the rule. If just looking at the rule either doesn't help you answer or leads to an absurd result, they do look at the rationale of the rule. We'll spend more time on when they look at rationale in the next class as well. So that'll give you more clarity on that. Some of you have asked, is there a possibility that the same rule can apply differently to different people? See, the general understanding is that a rule applies to the same category of people, the same class of people generally. There's no question there, there's no doubt there. But there may be exceptions, right? There may be qualifications within that rule of when it may apply to a particular person, when it may not. That really depends on one, the content of the rule itself. And if we do not find an answer in the content of the rule, then things like the rationale of the. Okay, some of you are asking technical questions about the marital rape example that I gave you, right? I'm happy to have a longer conversation on that outside. Maybe you can drop me an email. We can discuss how conflicting rules, like what may seem conflicting with respect to conjugal rights, but conjugal rights need not necessarily be conflicting with the idea of recognizing marital rape. But that's a conversation that we can have. You can drop me an email and we can have a longer discussion on that. Some of you have mentioned um, uh, rape laws that are not gender neutral can be under inclusive. Absolutely, right? Rape laws that are not inclusive or gender neutral can absolutely seem to be under inclusive um, laws as well. That's a great example. Thank you for that. Okay. There's one question about generality. One second. Okay, one of you have asked when a particular law applies to only one section of people, when a rule applies to only one section of people, how could you still say it has general application? It generally applies to that. That's what I said in the beginning itself. Remember that example I told you of the traffic signal? The traffic signal rule applies to everyone riding on that particular route, correct? So to that extent, it has general application, but it may be limited only to a particular set of people. Within that set of people, it applies generally. That is what this idea of generality means. Remember that category Z. So that category Z can be a limited category Z. But within that category Z, it technically, it usually applies to everybody within that category Z. And that's what gives it the idea of generality. All right. Okay, so what I will do, some of you are not able to follow this question and answer. So as much as possible, I try to read out the question and then answer that so that this confusion is not there. That's my mistake. I will read out the question and then you could, and then answer it. So that will give you some context on which questions I am answering. All right, we'll go back to our discussion. There are two topics that I want to quickly finish, and then we'll carry on this discussion on rule and rationale in the next class as well to get a better sense of this. Quickly, what I'll try to do, some of you are still not able to access this Word document. I don't know what the reason is, but if you could quickly just read exercise 3, I'll try to increase the font so that, yeah, it's better. I hope it's more visible now, right? If you could just read exercise 3 quickly, and then we'll have a discussion on pervasiveness of rules. It's a very short para. Okay, I can actually just read this out. Imagine someone asks you a yes or no question. Your mouth is full, and so you nod yes as a response. This is an example of a cultural rule. Things like body language, gestures, and so on are examples of cultural and social rules that are not instituted by force or authority. They are often subjective and operate differently in different countries or time periods, but these are also important rules. Imagine you nod yes when you wish to say no, you will not be able to communicate. Rules may or may not be rooted in logic, but we understand and follow them at most times anyway. So that's the extract that's been shared with you. Just give me a minute. Right? Now, let's just try to understand this a little, right? So we see that there are different kinds of rules that operate. They could be cultural rules, like as simple as saying yes or no, right? Just shaking your head and saying yes or no is that one simple way of looking at a form of a cultural rule. You have rules in a classroom, right? How we conduct ourselves in this Zoom call. The way that I said at the beginning of the class that the way we would interact is through the Q&A feature, and I will stop and I will interact in that manner. These are rules that are there in a classroom. They may not be legal rules, but they are rules nevertheless. You have rules in sports, right? They tell you how you play that particular sport. You have traffic rules. We've already discussed traffic rules in a lot of detail. We even have rules for grammar, how we write, how we read. So rules are there around us, not all of the rules that we think are legal rules. You have religious rules, you have social rules, you have cultural rules, you have rules of language that is also defining how we have this conversation together. That's informing the conversation in this classroom. So in this Zoom space itself, think about the various kinds of rules that are coming into play. You have a set of classroom rules that are coming into play. You have a set of grammar rules that are coming into play, right? There are institutional rules that tell you that you have to attend this class. There are institutional rules that tell you whether whether this course will be graded or not. So even within this, just this classroom space on this Zoom call, there are so many different kinds of rules that are coming in together. Just think about this, right? Is there any aspect of your everyday life that's not governed by rules of some sort? Is there some place where rules do not apply to you? Can you do anything you like without the fear of breaking a rule in your own home? Just think about these things, simple things. Playing your favorite music very loudly in the middle of the night may not be possible, may not be socially acceptable because there is a social rule that you respect, that others require peace and quiet in the night time. Leaving the garbage unattended and it starts raising a stink and it escapes from your windows, stenching up your neighborhood, right? These are again social rules. Using too much water that the taps in your building run dry. Again, you're mindful of the society. These are again social rules that are emerging in various contexts, right? Uh, you may be violating rules in each of these circumstances, and you may feel like you can break the rule in certain places because it may not give you a punishment, right? So even though there are these various rules that are operating in our everyday lives, there is a hierarchy amongst them. We give more attention to some rules, we pay more attention to some rules, and we may not pay so much attention to some rules. This comes from, like some of you mentioned, because it comes from an authority, because it has some sort of legal backing, right? Some of you said Tughlaq didn't need an approval because the process doesn't require him to take an approval from the subjects in that particular kingdom, right? So there is this hierarchy amongst these various kinds of rules. You may follow a certain rule because you think it has that legal backing, it has that authority, and you may not follow some rules because, well, you're not, I mean, violating it is not actually going to lead to any major punishment for you, or you don't think that there's any value in following those particular rules. So although there is this pervasiveness of rules all around you, there is a hierarchy amongst them as well that we need to be mindful of, right? And this hierarchy is where legal rules then come into play. Legal rules are slightly on the higher end of this hierarchy, primarily because of the fact that it comes with a certain authority, it comes with a certain backing, and non adherence to the rules can lead to consequences in the form of punishments and sanctions as well. So, what is it that makes a legal rule a rule? The source of it. Where is it coming from? The authority of it. And it is also ranked higher in the hierarchy of rules primarily because of that legal authority that it has and the fear of punishment itself. Yeah. So I thought I will also, this is one place because we're saying these rules are there everywhere. How are these rules different from legal rules? I thought I will just flag that here as well. Okay. If you don't, let's just pull up, sorry, 1 minute. I hope you can all see my screen. So exercise 4, some of the questions in exercise 4 is what I've tried to address so far about the hierarchy of rules, why legal rules carry more weight than other rules, and what is the difference between the various kinds of rules, right? Let's try to look at it in an example, right? What I have just said, that is exercise 4. Think about the rules of driving. Some of these rules, such as you may not jump a signal, are legal rules, or violating them will result in a fine or some sort of punishment. On the other hand, you have rules like you can only overtake from the right. Violating this rule would not necessarily result in a punishment depending on the context, right? There are some countries which even find this because it has legal backing. In India, for instance, this rule may not have legal backing in all states or all cities. So in those states that it doesn't have legal backing, there's no fine, there's no punishment, and therefore the first rule discussed will become a legal rule and it carries with it the force of law. The second rule becomes a cultural or a social rule, slightly lower in the hierarchy, right? Because it doesn't have that legal backing and there is no fear or of punishment that comes with it. So that I what I've just explained so far, this is an example of that you see in exercise 4. Now, if you could take about 5 minutes to just read through exercise 5, it will be very useful because this places in context our discussion that we had slightly earlier about over inclusiveness and under inclusiveness. So take about 5 minutes. I've kept it, so I've zoomed in so the font is not too small for all of you to see. And I will scroll through this in bits so you can read the extract for those of you who don't have a copy of it, but the copy is available on LMS. It's okay even if you have missed it. After class, you can download it and go through it as well. All right. Assuming most of you have had a chance to read through this, it's okay if you haven't. Um, you can always go back to this. This material is available for you to look at on LMS, so that shouldn't be a concern at all. The purpose of showing you some of the difficulties that emerge with, because we easily say a rule is over inclusive or under inclusive, the difficulty in drafting is something that we also need to be mindful of, right? Although there are reasons behind there is a rule, you may understand the rationale behind it, it's very clear. It is very difficult to frame rules in a way that it is not under inclusive or that it is not over inclusive, and this COVID example is a great example of that, right? First issue that you see is, at the time of drafting the rules, you don't have all the information. It becomes very difficult to draft the rule without complete information. Over a period of time, you may get more information. Another situation would arise. Let's think a COVID example is one that's given in your extract. Let's think of another example, right? Say you're trying to draft a rule uh, about digital transactions. At the time that you are drafting that rule on digital transactions, you may not know what technological developments will emerge later on, or what situation may emerge later on that may pose a difficulty to your rule itself, making it either under inclusive or over inclusive. That difficulty that you have to often grapple with is that you don't have complete information. You can't account for all situations and circumstances because you cannot say which situation will occur when, which circumstance will occur when, and you can't account for that while drafting. That's one reason. Two, think about the complexities of drafting itself, right? And this is why one of the major reasons people say law is so technical, it's so difficult to read a rule and understand it, because what you're trying to is trying to accommodate for all of these situations within that to prevent ambiguity. So you're trying to pack it with more and more and more information, right? So it becomes more complex, which which again is one of the reasons why law is considered to be very complex. It's very difficult to break down. It becomes very technical. People who are not, trained in the law try to stay away from it. It's because of this very reason, because you're trying to accommodate for these situations and these circumstances that so that the rule doesn't become ambiguous, so that it doesn't become under inclusive and over inclusive, but you can't possibly provide for all of those situations as well. So there is a limitation to that. And what we are going to try to do, not in, we'll try to do a little bit of that in the next class as well. Maybe I'll spend about 10-15 minutes on that to see how we can break down these complex rules also, to pick out some of these characteristics and elements that we have discussed of a rule, right? Because now we know what are the components of a rule, we know the elements of a rule. So however complex a rule is, we should be able to break it down, right? So we'll spend some time in the next class seeing how we can break down these rules, what techniques we can use for us to better understand these complex rules as well. But the COVID example has been primarily given for you as an exercise. Extract here is for you to understand that law is complex, right? These rules are complex, and while we can sit here and discuss from a general standpoint that a rule is under inclusive, it's over inclusive, we also need to be mindful. And that's why one of you had mentioned change is something that we need to keep aspiring to. So we need to try and incorporate those changes within these rules as well, which is when, this sort of building and building and building is what makes law also a little more complex, but we will learn how to break through that as well. Yeah. So on this note, I will wrap up class. I'll quickly see the chat to see if there are any questions. For the next class, the things that we're going to be focusing on, so you can go through your readings and just acquaint yourself with these topics. First, we'll look at why we follow rules, right? What is it? What is the purpose of following rules? Why do we follow it? Second, we will look at, because when we're looking at why we follow rules, we'll look at the relationship between rules and values like justice and equality, like some of you have mentioned. Then we'll also look at the concept of rule pluralism, how different rules intersect with each other. Third thing we'll look at is interpretation. Why is there a need for rule interpretation, and how do we interpret? How do we break down a rule? So these are the three main topics of discussion for the next class. So when you're going through your readings, be mindful of that as you come prepared for the class in the next session. Yeah, I'll stop sharing my screen here. I'll just quickly see if there are any substantial questions that I need to take, and then we will discuss it. Yeah, okay. So some of you have questions about the next class's readings. Read session 2 readings. Yeah, so reads, if you haven't read session 1 readings already, read session 1 readings as well, and read session 2 readings. We're not doing session 3 just as yet. The reason for that confusion is because I was not there in the last class. So Professor Siddharth had to step in. But don't worry, we will make up for that. Don't stress too much about syllabus. Please prepare for session 2 readings for the next class. We do not have class, we don't have this class tomorrow. I think our next class will be on the 26th of October, if I'm not wrong, according to my calendar. You may have your other courses and other classes for tomorrow, and if your links are not up, please write to the PACE admin team and they'll be able to help you out with that. One of you have asked me about rule pervasiveness. What do we mean by it? That rules are there all around us. There are different kinds of rules all around us: cultural rules, social rules, religious rules, legal rules, rules of grammar, rules in sports. We are surrounded by rules. Every aspect of our life is surrounded by rules, but there is a hierarchy in it. So while rules are pervasive, they're all around us, there is a hierarchy within these rules. And exercise that example that I gave you about overtaking on the right? That is a rule that's not as high as a rule, a legal rule which tells you how you should conduct yourselves. The way you sort of distinguish between a cultural rule and a legal rule: first, the authority, the source where it's coming from. Second, this notion of punishment attached to it. Right? Broadly, these are the ways you can classify a rule as a legal rule and a non-legal. Okay, so a lot of you are asking for book recommendations for people who are coming from non-legal background. The Twinning and Myers book itself is a great source. So you can look at that. I'll share a couple of other sources on LMS for you as supplementary reading for those of you who want to read it. So Thinking Like a Lawyer, I will share that book. The Frederick Schauer book as well, I will share it. There's another book by Jeremy Waldron. I will share that as well. So I'll share 3 books for you to look at if you want to read further. Um, don't stress too much about it. Those books, just because I'm posting it, is not mandatory. It's for those people who are interested and want to read further. The extracts that have been uploaded on LMS already, those are mandatory and you're required to read them for class. Yeah. Okay. The material that's available on LMS is already good enough. Read that. You should be fine. Follow the classes. But I will share more books for you on LMS as well. So you can look at that. I'll share some book names as well. You can look that up on LMS. I've shared my email ID already. So you can, it's in the, one of you had asked for it and I've answered it as a comment. So you can pull that up. If you have any further questions, you can write to me. All right. Have a great weekend and I will see you on October 26th. Yeah. Thank you.